I'm delighted to have you here for this very special conversation with the president, with Kay Coles James, the president of the Heritage Foundation. Kay has been a wonderful friend for a number of years. I first got to know her while I was doing my dissertation research on faith in the halls of power. At the time, she was serving as the director of the Office of Personnel Management under President George W. Bush. She actually has a lifetime of leadership in public life and has held a number of different roles, first appointed by President Reagan and then reappointed by President George H.W. Bush to serve on the National Commission on Children. Also under Bush 41, she was the Associate Director of the National Drug Control Policy and Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She has done an amazing job during her run at the Heritage Foundation, which has recently been named the #1 think tank in the world for its impact on public policy. She was appointed to serve as the chair of the National Coronavirus Recovery Commission and also appointed by President Trump as the commissioner on the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. She and her husband, Charles, founded the Gloucester Institute, a leadership development center for African-American young people. She's been an ardent, committed leader in the pro-life movement, serving as the chief spokesperson for the National Right to Life Committee in the 1980s. She also served as the dean of the School of Public Policy at Regent University, our sister CCCU institution. She holds an undergraduate degree from Hampton University and many, many other honorary degrees. And we are delighted to be able to welcome Kay. She also served on the National Advisory Council for the Women in Leadership Study that Gordon and Wheaton College co-sponsored a number of years ago. And she's been committed to helping empower young people and people of color throughout her leadership and helping to advance the conservative movement. Kay, thank you so much for joining us. We're delighted to have you here at Gordon College this morning.
It is my delight and my joy. Always good to come back.
Kay, everybody grows up with what we might call an expected life story. We pick it up from our parents or from our community about what our life is supposed to look like when we grow up. Tell us, what was that sort of expected life story that you sensed as a young person? How has your life either aligned with it or diverged from it?
Wow, what a great question. And indeed, there was an expected life story. It was that I would go to college, be the first in my family to graduate, become a teacher, marry, join a church, and live out my life as a high school history teacher. Everyone in my family, all the women were teachers, and that was the path. I went to Hampton University and got a degree in secondary education, and I was well on my way to that path. And things didn't turn out quite that way.
When did you make the move into public policy or public life?
That happened quite by accident. And I tell people I am absolutely the wrong person that you ever want to invite to a career fair to say, how do I plan out my career? What courses should I take? What steps should I take to advance? Because I was an abysmal failure at all of that. I was a full-time stay-at-home mom whose most controversial decision I made every day was what to take out of the freezer for dinner. And quite frankly, I was given the opportunity to speak out on an issue that I felt passionately about, and that was on the life issue. I thought it was one of the greatest civil rights issues of our time, and I needed to speak out and have my voice heard on that. And as a result of that, I was asked if I would take a detour and go to the National Right to Life and become a spokesperson. And I did that, and that led into other areas of public policy that I cared deeply about. And my life took a detour, and I was on a trajectory and never quite made it back to the classroom. But I think that's why I enjoy being on college campuses and speaking to high school audiences and working with youth so much.
Was your faith always important to you, Kay?
Yes, since I was a senior in high school. And this is one of the reasons I have never had anything but positive and good things to say about televangelists, because they reached into my living room, and it was a Billy Graham crusade. And Billy Graham said, that if I gave my life to Christ, he could help me be the person I wanted to be, but felt powerless to become. And he seemed like a reasonable gentleman, and that sounded reasonable. So I approached it from a very scientific point of view. I determined that I would give my life to Christ, give him a year, see what he could do with it. And if he pretty much screwed it up, I was taking it back. And I also decided that night that I would learn something about this Jesus Christ that I had given my life to. Now, this is going to date me. So I decided to go to the card catalog and look up Jesus, last name Christ, and see what I could learn about him, and discovered, oh yeah, the Bible is about all this religious stuff. So I started reading the Bible, and thank goodness the only one I could find in the house was a New Testament. And to show you just how absurd I was, I said, this is the dumbest book I have ever read. I got all the way through Matthew and said, it's starting to repeat itself. I already read these stories. Why is it telling me this again? But it's also a testimony to what God can do if you truly give him your life. I stuck with it. And it wasn't until I got to Hampton University that I was sitting in the cafeteria alone and heard some people discussing the Bible. And it was the formation of an InterVarsity group at Hampton University. And they noticed that I was listening, and a really cute guy asked if I'd like to come to Bible study. Now, what freshman is going to turn down the opportunity from a really cute guy, even if it's to go to a Bible study, you know? And I went and found that I didn't have, I did have at that time an Elijah complex. I didn't know any other Christians. Only me, Lord, out here by myself. And went and discovered a community of believers. And by the way, that really cute guy turned out to be someone who's sort of well known in the evangelical circles, particularly among Black theologians. It was Carl Ellis. And I don't know if you know that name.
Yeah, of course.
And he was a part of mentoring me as a young Christian. And I grew under his mentorship and that of other Christians on the campus at that time.
Hey, I know that you grew up in Virginia, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I remember from your background that you were involved in going to one of the first desegregated schools in Virginia. Could you talk a little bit about that experience?
It was a traumatic and troubling experience. Most junior high school girls are concerned about how to sneak the blue eyeshadow past their moms, you know, to wear in school. We were concerned about barking dogs, angry parents who showed up outside the school with barricades that we had to get through in order just to go to class. It was a very difficult experience, not just from the students who called us names. I have back problems today because I was pushed down steps and had a dislocated coccyx that with bad weather today, I still have horrible backaches, stuck with pins as we went down the hall. The hallways were crowded and changing classes, so you never knew where the pin sticks were coming from. The teachers calling us names and having to go from being a straight A student to getting mostly D's and F's because they tried to discourage us and send us back to our segregated schools by giving us bad grades. And that's when we heard from our mentors and from the NAACP that was supporting us and our parents and relatives. I came home one day and I was crying because I knew I'd done really well on a test. And I said to my aunt who was raising me, she didn't give me an A, and I know this is an A. And she said, well, then you go back and you take an A. You make sure that everything on that paper is correct, and she has no choice but to mark it as an A. So very early in life, I learned that I wasn't going to be given A's. I had to take them.
And Kay, going through that kind of an experience as a junior high student, that has, I mean, it has to have a really deep impact on how you think about race relations in our culture and how it's shaped. How did that experience affect sort of your own understanding?
Well, I know that racism is alive and well. I experienced it not only then as a junior high school student, but as the president of the Heritage Foundation as well, even in today's time and today's culture. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I have when I'm working within the conservative movement and within the evangelical movement is to help white evangelicals and conservatives understand that racism is a thing. I'm amazed that I even have to say that. And somehow people interpret that as meaning that I believe America is a racist country. I do not. I absolutely do not. Do we still have racist individuals in our country? Yes. Do we still have institutions that are tainted by racism? You better believe it. And one of the reasons I think we as conservatives have a difficult time reaching out to new audiences and bringing them in and helping them to understand our perspective is because we don't deal honestly with some of the biggest issues in our country. And we have an orthodoxy that we have. And if you veer from that orthodoxy at all, the wrath of the right comes down on you. Some of your students and faculty may be aware of the flare up that I had when I dared say after the George Floyd murders that racism is a thing and it's real. It was amazing to me that by saying that and saying we want to have honest conversations, that I came under attack in conservative media from not everyone, but some. And so that to me is one of the most disheartening parts of my job. I have a unique perspective on these things. And I am determined to speak my truth. And quite frankly, the reason that I am a conservative today is because I believe that certain conservative values and principles, and certainly beyond any shadow of a doubt, my faith convictions leads me to speak into the issues of the day in a compassionate and a compelling way. And if we as conservatives don't know how to do that, we will lose three of the biggest constituencies that I think are important for sustaining our democracy. We will lose youth, we will lose minorities, and we will lose women.
Okay, so you say you have a unique perspective on these issues. What do you think is the right way for us to try and heal the divisions that we see in our society around racial tensions? And how do we help try to make the common good more forefront for all people?
You know, the first thing I think we need to do is to speak honestly and candidly to one another. I think that I recoil at the cancel culture in our country today, but I recoil not only from the left, but from the right as well. And I refuse to have people on the right try to cancel out my experience and tell me it isn't valid or real. And so I am determined to speak my truth with compassion, with a desire for healing. Because once we do that and people truly understand, I think we as Christians have to lead this movement because we have the capacity to understand forgiveness. We have the capacity to understand what it means when we can move beyond hurt, pain, forgive one another, embrace each other, and walk forward. And so I think that I have a special responsibility. One, to speak the truth. Two, to forgive when appropriate. And three, to help plot a pathway forward. And quite frankly, if we don't do that as God's people, I don't think there's much of a chance for the whole rest of the country. And I don't think there's a chance for the world, because if we can't do it, what do we expect from the Sunnis and the Shias? What do we expect from tribalism that's going on with some of the wars in some of the African nations? I think we as God's people have to model what that looks like. And the first thing white evangelicals have to do is be intentional about listening and wanting to understand.
You know, Kay, I was reflecting last night when I was preparing for our time together. I first got to meet you through Don Powell.
Oh my word.
I had interviewed Don Powell, who at the time was the head of the FDIC, appointed by President Bush to that position. And he talked about his own experience as a white man from West Texas, and how, I guess it was maybe in the aftermath of 9/11, he really wanted to have a chance to develop closer friendships with people who were different than he was. And he talked about, I think maybe getting together with you to pray on occasion or other sort of opportunities, but also just said, as a white man who really had not spent a lot of time with many people of color, developing what he considered to be a very close friendship with a Black woman who was also a leader in the administration was a significant part of his own sort of journey of discovery. Could you tell me a little about sort of your friendship with Don and how that, represents, I don't know, one strategy of trying to make some connections at the interpersonal level?
By the way, Don and Tawana Powell became very dear friends of ours. I didn't know him at all. He reached out to me and he expressed exactly what you said. And by that time, I had told another group, and I'm not proud of this, but a small group who had invited me to get together to talk about race relations. I'm not proud of this. I had to ask Jesus to forgive me. But I said to them, you know what? I'm tired. I'm tired of these kind of conversations. Go find yourself a young Black person who hasn't had as many of these conversations and as many disappointments as I have, and start with them. And so I had said, I've shut that aside. But when Don called, I heard a sincerity in his voice and a desire that, okay, maybe this guy really wants to do this. And we got together for prayer. We brought our families together. We got to know each other on that level. And boy, am I glad that I did, because we formed a friendship and relationships that condescend race, that condescend class. And I had the opportunity to have a friendship, and our families became close. I mean, I would have missed that if I had stayed in that place of just being tired and not wanting to go down that road. But all the credit for that goes to Don, not to me. That credit goes to him because he was intentional. He was sincere. He wanted to have this quest in his life. And quite frankly, only as more people get to that point in both races will we begin to see real healing. And I'm not sure, apart from Christ, how we can make those kinds of headways and gains. But I'll tell you, anyone who comes to me with that level of sincerity, that desire to make a difference, even if you're tired, you have to respond to that. And so I would encourage everyone to do that, and not just during Black History Month, for crying out loud. There was a time, and there was an old joke about Black people love Black History Month. We got invited to more lunches during Black History Month than you could possibly imagine. But if you're sincere about this and sincere about race relations, then be sincere in March, April, May, and June.
Okay, one of the things that Gordon is trying to grapple with are the larger sort of theoretical, philosophical frameworks that are out there. And of course, one that's been of conversation really since President Trump issued an executive order to not have critical race theory as part of some federal training. It just became part of sort of the common conversation around race over the last 6 months. And certainly within the church and Christian institutions. The Southern Baptist Seminaries, for example, issued a statement denouncing critical race theory a few months ago. Then other institutions have been endorsing critical race theory. First off, what is it from your perspective, and what's your take on the role of CRT in the life of Christian community?
Well, that's a very complex question that we could spend a great deal of time on. I will try to be as succinct as I can be. And I'll do that by sharing a story with you. They wanted me to put out a tweet at the Heritage Foundation commending the president for stopping critical race theory within the government. And I said, there's no way in the world I'm going to do that. And they said, well, aren't you against critical race theory? And I said, sure I am, but I'm not going to put out a tweet saying that. And they said, why? And I said, I'd be happy to do a full-on paper, because saying you're against critical race theory automatically says to a group of people who may not necessarily dig down and understand all the nuances, oh, so you don't believe in racial reconciliation. Oh, so you don't believe in a program that will help us work through. Of course I do. But many of these issues are so much more complex than that. You know, at the base, there are things within the critical, there's lots about it that's very good, but there are also some things embedded in it which I take great issue with. And, you know, you can get into a discussion about how it views the nuclear family. You can get into how it views capitalism. You can look at some of the strands of it which border on anti-Semitism. So there are pieces and parts that we need to deconstruct. But you know what's even a better conversation to have? Why is it that we as evangelicals, as conservatives, have not come up with a construct that really goes after racial reconciliation. Well, I don't like to say racial reconciliation, by the way, and I'll explain that in a minute. Because we've offered no alternative. And so when people think that you are opposed to that particular set of beliefs, even when there are parts of it that you agree with, they want to know what's your alternative. And by the way, I caught myself on racial reconciliation because I believe we should be working on racial conciliation. Reconciliation implies that at some point we had it right and we need to go back and reconcile. But that's not true. We've never quite gotten it right. And so we need to look at what does that look like and how does that feel when we get it right? And only because I believe we have not offered a positive alternative, people reach for that. I think we don't do enough of, as conservatives and as evangelicals, to say what's good about it, what is right about it. And we don't acknowledge racism, and we've come up with no alternative. So a part of what I'd like to do in my next life is develop a set of values and beliefs that help us figure out how to deal with these issues in a biblical and constructive way.
We want to invite you to get in on the conversation. If you'd like to pose a question to Mrs. James, you can send your question to q@gordon.edu, and I'll be happy to try and pose those to her. That's q@gordon.edu. Kay, when you think about the work of racial conciliation and public policy, are there 2 or 3 initiatives that you think would make a positive difference in American society that would also work for that racial conciliation value that you hold out?
You mean in terms of organizations or programs?
Either at the individual level, so public policy that would affect individuals, or within organizations or society-wide. What can we do from a public policy perspective to try and improve the racial climate?
Got it. First of all, we need to learn how to talk about the issues that matter. As an example, I care deeply about issues, policy issues surrounding healthcare, education, issues surrounding national defense, issues surrounding poverty. And those are not issues that typically you hear at the top of the list for conservatives. And so I think that people like Bob Woodson, who has done a phenomenal job of translating what it looks like when you genuinely care about poverty and want to do it from a biblical and a conservative perspective. I think people like John Perkins has done an incredible job in working towards racial reconciliation and some of those issues. And one of the things that that I spend a lot of time on is trying to figure out how to talk about these issues that matter in compassionate and compelling ways. All of those policy issues are important to a constituency. And the reason that I am a conservative today is because in my heart of hearts, I know that if I want to contribute to human flourishing and change the lives of people within the communities that I care deeply about, those are conservative values that we have been terrible at articulating in compassionate and compelling ways. Let me just give you one example that's important to me is poverty. When I was asked by the governor of Virginia to come in and reform Virginia's failed welfare system, the rhetoric surrounding welfare reform was largely rhetoric surrounding the economic impact on our budgets, that entitlement programs were growing and that we needed to bring these programs under control because in fact, spending was out of control. And I said to the governor at that time, I have no interest in coming in and reforming welfare in order to balance the budget. I want to come in and reform welfare because the welfare system is detrimental to my community and it needs to be fixed. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I want to reform welfare in order to empower Black people.
So many questions have come in. Let me start with one. Do you think that part of the challenge that we face around the cultural divide in our, political body is a result of having a two-party system and the rise of identity politics? What role do you think those two factors, two parties as opposed to multi-party and identity politics, is playing into some of these divisions?
Well, I tend to like to deal in what is and where we are. Right now, we have a two-party system in this country, and I think both parties are struggling for their identity. Who are they going to be? Is the Democrat Party going to be the party of the far, far left and Antifa? Is the Republican Party going to be the party of the far, far right and the Proud Boys? And so we have a lot of work to do in both places. And those individuals who are slightly left of center, slightly right of center, have got to come together, form alliances, and figure out how we win that back. And I hate identity politics. And I think it is divisive, and I think it has divided our country. It has divided our party, both parties, in fact, and I reject it wholeheartedly.
Do you have some advice for a young person who wants to enter into public policy? What could they do as a college student that would help them prepare for a career in public policy?
The first thing you need to do right now is to apply to become a Heritage Foundation intern. And I really do believe it is the best internship program out there if you want to get a firm grounding in policy and access to the jobs and individuals in Washington who hire young people. Some of the testimonials that we get back are absolutely incredible. And Heritage Family is a strong family. Once you're in, you're part of the family, and they are serving at every level of government, federal, our interns, federal, state, local level, and even in cabinet officers, and just very proud of them. The neat thing about it is right now you can do it remotely and virtually, and get, I'd say you get about 80% of the experience online.
Could you suggest a couple of key thinkers, either in the evangelical world or in the wider academy, who you think effectively speak to issues of race?
Well, you know, one of the things that has concerned me recently is there are some folks out there who I've admired and respected, whether it's John Piper, or whether it's Tim Keller, or whether it's David French, who people admired and respected until they started talking about race. And then all of a sudden it's, you know, they have issues and they have problems. And so I think all of them have said some very interesting things. Piper has some great videos out there that he's done on these issues that I think are very compelling.
You had given the example of how Don Powell reached out to you to try and develop a friendship. Aside from doing something like that, are there specific ways you could encourage Gordon undergraduates to work toward racial conciliation, either at the individual level or the institutional level?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd say I have discovered that many Black people are tired, young and old. Because when I punted to the young folks, they said, "We're tired too." And I believe that most of this work is going to have to be done from what I call the woke right. You can be woke on the left, but you can also be woke on the right, by the way. And once you realize that those are issues that are important, educating yourself about those issues, having conversations about those issues with people at your church, in your neighborhood, in the communities. It's time for those individuals who get it to stand up within your own communities and check. You know that when someone tells an off-color joke about race or gender or sexuality, it's your responsibility in a loving, caring, compassionate way to address it. Don't let it go by. You can intentionally decide to build relationships outside of your tribe. It's amazing to me, people's perspectives and the perspectives that they have, because they stay in their own tribe. It's boring. If you came on my Facebook page, I have people across the spectrum, and I am a richer person because of it. I am challenged daily because of friends that I have that I can engage in intellectual debate about. And I hate it when I see it, as I said, on the left or the right, this cancel culture. There's something toxic in our environment right now that says, if you disagree with me philosophically or ideologically, you're an evil person and I want you destroyed. I will destroy you. And I see people who are godly people who want to destroy someone who disagrees with them, who wants to cancel them out. And so I think the more we stand up and rebel against that, call them out, say you have no place. I want to see the Republican Party of the country say in even stronger terms, you have no place in our party if you are a racist, if you're a misogynistic. if you're homophobic, there's no place for you here. And I think as we do that, we will lose some people, but we will gain so many more.
Do you think that the polarization on the left and right is a new thing, or that social media has just allowed us to reveal things that have been there all along?
It's not a new thing. It's not a new thing. If you've been Black and in America for 73 years, like I have been, it's not a new thing. But I do believe that what's happened was that social media has amplified it, magnified it, and given it a sort of anonymity so that people will post things, say things, do things, and hide behind a call name that doesn't disclose who they are. So they feel freer to say these things publicly. So I think I like it out in the open. I want to know who you are. So I'm not concerned about it's more out there right now. I knew it was there, and now I just know who it is.
Someone wrote, we hear the phrase, silence is violence, but some of us are not used to leading a charge. Can I be a force for change on racial issues without being an activist?
Boy, that's a tough one. Because at this point in our culture, in our country, I think we all have to be activists. I think Christ calls us to be activists. He calls us to be activists for peace. He calls us to be activists for reconciliation. He calls us to be activists for the gospel. And we might as well get in our heads that we are not going to go out and lead quiet lives. And I always like to tell college students something that I learned from a dear friend of mine, as I heard him speak one time, John Agri, so I can't take credit for it. He said, do you really think that God invested as much in you as he did, that your parents spent all this money to get you educated, that your grandparents are at home praying for you like crazy, that your family is supporting you so that you can go out and be mediocre? Everybody is doing that so that you can go out and be disruptive. If you are not planning right now in your life to go out and be disruptive, then you are not paying homage to the people who have sacrificed to make you who you are today. And so my challenge is nobody gets to not be an activist. Everybody has got to be a disruptor.
One question about your leadership journey. Can you tell us about a time when you had to lead through a crisis and how you stayed grounded in your faith in that particular season?
Probably the best example of that was on the morning of 9/11. On that morning, I led the federal workforce, millions of federal workers, over 300,000 of them in the Washington, D.C. metro area. And I remember getting the call when the first plane hit. I watched TV as the second plane hit. And then I watched the smoke rising from the Pentagon. And as Providence would have it, I'm a good Presbyterian, all of the right people that I needed for making decisions were in the office that morning. And I called them together and I said, all of us are at different places in our lives. All of us have a different spiritual journey. I want you to know you have the absolute freedom to walk out of this door right now and go home and no one will judge you. I also know that we have a responsibility to make decisions and lead right now. So I'm going to give you a minute to go back to your offices and think through this, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes. And if you're not here, God bless you. and you're on it. And I use that 15 minutes to pray. And to my surprise, every one of them came back. These were political and career appointees. And we worked together that day. And I can remember saying something that sounds idiotic in its saying now, but made perfect sense in the moment, which is the purpose of terrorism is to terrorize. And I refuse to be terrorized. So let's get to work. I don't know where that came from. I can tell you I went through the day. By the time I went home at 8 o'clock that night, the streets of Washington were clear. And I went home, and I told y'all I'm a Presbyterian, so I get to drink wine. Had a wonderful glass of wine, and then my hand started to shake. But God gave me what I needed in the moment. And I can tell you that when I think back about it, I don't know where that came from. The ability to say the things that were said in the moment, but it was a gift from God in that moment to be able to lead that team. And I wrote an op-ed about the next day because the president's chief of staff called and it was really my call. What are we going to do with government the next day? What is your recommendation? Are we going to open federal offices, or are we going to close? What are we going to do? And I refused to bow to the terrorist. And I said, oh, we're going to be open. And everybody knows that we appreciate our military. We applaud their service, but they're cousins. We have the military service, but we also have the civil service. And I called it 1,000,000 acts of quiet defiance, because the next day I opened the federal offices and those people came back to work, and they crossed bridges that they didn't know if they were going to blow up. They went in through the metro where they didn't know if someone was going to release gas. They came back into those buildings not knowing if there was a car bomb outside. And I will always be grateful for the federal workforce and how they conducted themselves during 9/11. And I don't think they get enough credit for it, and how they continued the sustaining work. Social Security checks went out. The MAP division was still doing maps so that our troops would know where to go. Medicare and Medicaid still operated. So it was 1,000,000 acts of quiet defiance. And I am so glad that the Lord gave me the opportunity to be there in that moment and to lead during that time.
Well, Kay Coles-James, we're so grateful to have you here as part of this conversation with the president and our morning convocation. Let me say a word of prayer, and with that, we'll be dismissed. Lord God, thank you so much for Kay, for her life, and for her leadership. We pray that you will guide her, give her wisdom as she speaks to public issues. We do pray, Father, for racial conciliation in our culture. We pray it in our own individual lives and in the institutions where we serve. We pray that for the Gordon community. May we be ever mindful that these kind of efforts are not just happening during Black History Month, but they're part of our calling to work for your shalom, the flourishing of your people across time and ages. And we commit this to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Kay, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. God bless you. And everyone, thanks for being with us. Have a good Friday.
Thank you.